Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Cowan-Smith. Tonight, Ethiopia's Prime Minister and France's President meet at the Elysee. Abiy Ahmed headed here on his first trip to Europe since taking office in April, and Paris is keen to support the reforms brought in under the Ethiopian leader. Also, at least 15 people are injured in a suicide bombing in central Tunis. No one other than the attacker was killed, but most of those hurt were members of the security services. We hear from our correspondent with more. And after a week of violent protests, Ghana asks for the resignation of the Vice-Chancellor of the Kwale Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. It closed down indefinitely after rallies degenerated into violence last Tuesday. But first, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed arrived in France on Monday on his first trip to Europe since taking office back in April. He met with French President Emmanuel Macron at the Elysee before the two pledged to boost cultural and diplomatic ties between their countries. Abiy's 6 months on the job has already led to some substantial political and economic reforms. Nicolas Chemin from our Africa desk is with us for a closer look at his trip to France and his efforts whilst in office. Nick, so are France and Ethiopia particularly close? Tell us more about what came out of this meeting between Macron and Abiy.
Well, they held a very brief press conference, and first of all, Macron said it was an honour that for his first European trip he'd chosen Paris, and then Macron also announced that he would be going to Ethiopia in March 2019. Then both men said that they admired each other's reforms, and in fact they have a similar profile. Macron is 40 and Abiy is 42, and both like to see themselves as great reformers. On the agenda were economic, cultural and environmental issues. For the cultural issues, they said that they would see how France could help rebuild Ethiopia's national palace and also take part in archaeological projects. After his meeting with Macron, Abiy was heading to the MEDEF, which is the Union of French Business Leaders, because, of course, Ethiopia is a vast market, 100 million inhabitants, Africa's second most populous country. And then he's heading to Germany on Tuesday. And what's interesting with this visit is that, once again, we see that Macron is not only interested in French-speaking African countries, like many of his predecessors, he's particularly interested in the big players, for example, Nigeria, South Africa, and Ethiopia.
So it's been a whirlwind 6 months for Ethiopia under Abiy Ahmed. What is he doing that's so different to previous regimes?
Well, he has these radical reforms, and there have been some negative responses. For example, this month, you had hundreds of soldiers who marched onto his palace. Analysts said that they were close to the Tigrayans, the Tigrayan ethnic minority. They ruled the country since 91. And then, of course, Abiy Ahmed came to power in April, and he's from the Oromo ethnic group. They're the majority ethnic group. So Abiy Ahmed held talks with these soldiers, and a few hours later he was seen, he was filmed smiling and even doing push-ups with these men. So we see also that he's media savvy. And a few days later, Abiy Ahmed said that these military leaders had been wanting to try and stop his radical reforms. And when we talk about the radical reforms, we talk about him making peace with Eritrea, also starting peace talks with several Ethiopian rebel groups, and also releasing thousands of political prisoners. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, we've also seen in September, for example, there were tensions in Addis, and he arrested 3,000 youth, and he sent them to rehabilitation camps. 1,000 were released 1 month later, and the police said, I quote, their brainwashing was complete. So we see that he has these major reforms that they're not pleasing everyone. And the big question now in Ethiopia is, will he push on with these reforms without becoming an authoritarian leader like many of his predecessors? And what we can say is that the signals he's been sending out so far are contradictory.
Thanks very much, Nicolas Chemin there. Now, over a dozen people were injured in Tunis on Monday after a suicide bomber blew herself up in the centre of the capital. About 10 of those hurt were police officers. It happened on Habib Bourguiba Avenue at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, no groups claimed responsibility for the attack. Fadil Aliriza joined us now with more. Fadil, do we know who the bomber was and why she did this?
Well, officials are saying that she's a 30-year-old single woman from the coastal region of Mahdia. Officials say she died on the spot of the explosion, but we don't have a motive yet. And security forces said she had no record of any criminal activity that known to them. Some reports say that she's been unemployed for 4 years despite having a university degree.
So no one was killed, but it is the first attack like this that the country's faced in a few years. How seriously are Tunisians taking this?
Well, many are taking it seriously. The Prime Minister visited some of the injured in the hospital tonight. Some politicians have renewed their calls to pass a law protecting security forces from prosecution, a law human rights groups have condemned and which has been stalled in Parliament for years. And meanwhile, police unions have called for a stricter implementation of the state of emergency, which has been currently in place for years. However, there's a vocal minority on social media that seems to not be taking it seriously, and bizarrely, some are even making jokes. Some have suggested that it might be partly because of the novelty of a bomber being a young woman. But it's also important to note that the explosion happened right near where a security forces van is regularly stationed, and that the number of security forces injured in this attack suggests this was specifically targeting security forces. Relations between civilians and security forces have been tense in recent months, with two high-profile cases where the use of force by security officials resulted in the death of a young person. Just steps away and from the explosion today, and minutes before, there had been a protest for a 19-year-old youth, Ayman Othmani, who was killed by state forces last week in a customs operation apparently gone wrong. There's also been rising cases of violence between security forces and soccer fans, which has also played out in dark jokes back and forth between security forces and fans on social media. All of this may explain the lack of seriousness amongst some on social media regarding the injured security forces.
Thanks very much. Fadil there for us in Tunisia. Now, after a weekend of violence, members of the Islamic Movement of Nigeria clashed with security forces in Abuja once again on Monday. The spokesperson of the Shiite group accused police of having again opened fire on unarmed protesters. On Saturday, 3 were killed by the military. Demonstrators are calling for the release of the IMN's leader, Ibrahim Zakzaki. He's been in custody since late 2015. Supporters of the Shiite cleric accuse authorities in the Sunni Muslim majority north of persecution. After a week of violent protest, Ghana's asked the Vice-Chancellor of the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology to step down. Known as KNUST, it closed down indefinitely after rallies degenerated into violence last Tuesday. Nathan Quao has more.
It's been 6 days since the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi was shut down by the Ashanti Regional Security Council following student protests there on that particular campus. The students were protesting what they described as oppressive rules and regulations. In the aftermath, 20 students were arrested by the police for vandalizing property during the protest. Following that, the Vice-Chancellor of the university, Professor Kwesi Obridanso, was asked to step down together with the university's management council. The move has angered university teachers and the administrative staff, and they have in turn gone on strike, saying that if the former authorities are not reinstated, they will not resume work. But how did we get here? A few weeks ago, 11 persons, 10 continuing students and 1 former student were arrested on the university campus. The university school authorities say that they were taking part in an unlawful vigil, thus they had to be picked up. Now the move angered students and they went on that protest, and we are waiting to see what the next step of this story will be.
And finally, the recycling revolution starts here. A boat made entirely out of recycled plastic has made its maiden voyage off the Kenyan island of Lamu, after locals spent more than 2 years picking up litter on their beaches to make it. The boat's called the Flip Floppy Dogo, and its builders are hoping to raise awareness about the scale of the problem of discarded plastic polluting the world's oceans. Take a look.
From the deck to the hull and mast, this boat was entirely built with recycled plastic, an ambitious project that was born here on the once pristine beaches of Lamu Island in Kenya.
We are having good beaches with white sand, but today is all been destroyed with scattered plastic around, and we have nothing to do with this plastic.
But these volunteers decided to take matters into their own hands. For the past 2 years, they've been collecting millions of pieces of discarded plastic that washed up on the island's shores. The waste was then sent to a recycling plant and transformed into building materials.
We basically shredded the plastic, would melt it down, we would create these big open cast molds, and we would then pour the plastic into there, it would dry, and we would have our pieces.
The result, a 9-meter-long boat, nicknamed the Flip-Floppy Doggo after the huge piles of flip-flops collected during the beach cleanups and that were used to make these colorful sheets. The project's founders now hope it will encourage people to rethink their plastic consumption.
The ultimate goal is to contribute to this global movement to end single-use plastic. The boat is very much just a positive symbol to showcase that it doesn't make any sense to have anything called single-use plastic.
After several water trials, the Flip-Floppy Doggo is now gearing up for its first real trip, a 500-kilometer journey from Lamu to Zanzibar. But its creators are already looking ahead to their next project, a much bigger boat that could sail all the way to Cape Town, more than 5,000 kilometers away.
The Flip-Floppy Doggo there taking a step in the right direction. That is, though, all we have time for. Thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Take care.
Idi Amin Dada, Uganda's despotic leader, presided over his country in the 70s. He is remembered in very different ways. Some recall the hundreds of thousands who were killed and tortured. However, those who were born after that horrific era laud his lesser-known accomplishments. For them, he was as a builder, a nationalist, and a separatist, the leader of time in Uganda's history, which they regard as a bygone golden era.
We revisit the compiler of Idi Amin Dada here on France 24.